Hi, we're going to talk through reinforcement schedules, part of the learning chapter. By the end of the video, we'll be able to describe the different types of reinforcement schedule and some of their characteristics. We'll also identify examples of each type of schedule. Finally, we'll apply that knowledge and use it to explain the shape of the graphs of various partial reinforcement schedules. Reinforcement schedules are categorized two ways: continuous reinforcement schedules and partial reinforcement schedules. We'll look at continuous schedules first. Continuous reinforcement schedules are those where behavior is rewarded every time. Imagine you're trying to get your dog to learn to shake your hand when you offer her yours. To get your dog to learn the trick, you might reward her when she puts her paw on your hand. If you reward her every time she puts her paw on your hand, you're using a continuous reinforcement schedule to get her to learn the trick.
Hi, it's me. So continuous reinforcement schedules create a strong association between behavior and response, and they're most effective when teaching a new behavior. So if you want something to be learned rapidly, for example, you'd typically use a continuous reinforcement schedule.
Unlike continuous schedules, where behavior is rewarded every time, partial reinforcement schedules are those where behavior is rewarded only some of the time. Remember our example from earlier, where you taught your dog to shake your hand. After she's learned to shake your hand, you might stop reinforcing your dog's behavior every time. So you might offer your hand and she shakes it, but you don't reward her behavior. You might repeat that. However, if she shakes your hand a third time, you might reward her behavior again.
The important thing to know is that partial reinforcement schedules are most effective once a behavior has already been established and mean a new behavior is less likely to disappear. So, for example, once you've taught the dog to shake your hand using a continuous schedule, you might switch to a partial schedule to try and make sure the behavior is enduring.
There are two variables that can be manipulated to create various types of partial reinforcement schedules, which is where things get a little more complicated. The variables are time and behavior. Schedules determined by time are called interval schedules, and schedules determined by behavior are called ratio schedules. Then each has a variable or a fixed form, which gives us four types of partial reinforcement schedules. 1. Variable interval. 2. Fixed interval. 3. Variable ratio. And 4. Fixed ratio. Here, fixed and variable describe the pattern of reward. Consider a variable interval schedule. It's an interval schedule, so it's determined by time. So variable in this case means that rewards arrive after varying lengths of time. In contrast, in a fixed interval schedule, fixed means that rewards arrive after a fixed period of time. On the other hand, consider a variable ratio schedule. It's a ratio scale, so it's determined by behavior. So variable in this case means that rewards arrive after varying numbers of the behavior.
All this means is that a reward might come after 3 instances of the behavior, then the next reward after 5 instances of the behavior, and then the next reward after 2 instances of the behavior, and so on.
In contrast, in a fixed ratio schedule, fixed means that rewards arrive after a fixed number of the behavior.
And all this means is that a reward might come after every 5 instances of the behavior, for example.
Let's look at some examples of each type of partial schedule. Imagine a surfer sitting out back and waiting for a wave to catch. The reward in this context is the thrill of riding a wave. When you're given an example like this, the first question to ask yourself is, what is the variable that's being manipulated? Is it time or is it behavior? In this case, it's time. Why? Well, the surfer can't just go and catch a wave whenever she wants. She has to wait for a good one to come along before she can receive her reward. So, because it's time that's being manipulated, it's an interval schedule. The second question to ask yourself is whether it's variable or fixed. Because we're talking about time in this context, that's like asking yourself whether the reward arrives after varying periods of time or after a fixed period of time. In this case, it's variable. Although waves come fairly regularly, our surfer has to wait for one she thinks is worth catching, and she doesn't know when one of those will come along. So this is an example of a variable interval schedule. Next, imagine an apple picker in an orchard who gets a bonus for every 5 boxes of apple they gather. Ask yourself the first question. What is the variable that's being manipulated? Is it time or behavior? In this case, it's behavior. The reward is determined by the apple picker going out and gathering enough boxes of apples. She doesn't just wait around for the reward. This makes it a ratio schedule. Now ask yourself the second question. Is it variable or fixed? Because we have a ratio schedule, in this case, variable means that rewards arrive after varying numbers of the behavior, and fixed means that rewards arrive after a fixed number of the behavior. The apple picker gets her bonus every time she fills 5 boxes. So in this example, the reward arrives after a fixed number of the behavior. So this is an example of a fixed ratio schedule.
Here's an important point with fixed ratio schedules like this one. So typically behaviors decrease briefly immediately after a reward is received and accelerate as repetitions get closer to the reward threshold. So in this case, this would correspond to something like our apple picker taking it easy right after she's received a bonus, then putting more and more effort in as she gets closer to those 5 boxes again.
Here's another example. Imagine you have a midterm every 2 weeks on Friday during the quarter for a class you're taking. Here, think of the reward as the relief after the midterm is over. Try and figure this one out yourself. Remember the steps. First, what is being manipulated? Time or behavior? This tells you whether it's an interval or a ratio schedule. After that, is the reward pattern fixed or varying? This is a fixed interval schedule. It's an interval schedule because time is the variable that's being manipulated. You can't just take the midterms whenever you like. You have to wait 2 weeks. It's a fixed schedule because rewards arrive after a fixed period of time. They arrive every 2 weeks.
And here's an important point with fixed interval schedules like this one. So typically the response increases rapidly just before the reinforcement occurs, and then it drops off after the reward arrives. So in this case, this will correspond to intense studying, something like that, right before the midterm, and then taking a few days off studying after you've completed the exam.
One last example. Imagine a golfer playing their game. The reward in this case is getting the ball in the hole. What do you think? This is a variable ratio schedule. It's a ratio schedule because the golfer's behavior is what determines whether a reward arrives or not. It's a variable schedule because it might take the golfer a different number of shots each time to get the ball in the hole. Some holes might take 3 shots, some might take 5. Now, let's put all this knowledge to use. Remember this graph from the book? It's a graph of each of the 4 types of partial reinforcement schedule that we've seen. Look at the fixed ratio graph. It flattens slightly after every reinforcement. Why?
Here's a hint. Try and think back to what I said about behaviors in fixed ratio schedules.
Next, look at the fixed interval graph. Why does it look like that?
Here's another hint. Try and think back to what I said about behaviors in fixed interval schedules.
The variable ratio graph flattens slightly at a few points, not necessarily after a reinforcement arrives. Why might it look like that?
Now, we didn't go over this explicitly, but try and use what we said about the patterns of behavior for fixed ratio schedules as a template.
Finally, the variable interval graph doesn't flatten anywhere, like some of the other graphs do. It's just a straight line. Now, why might it look like that?
Again, we didn't go over this explicitly, but try and take a guess. So what we've seen so far is that whenever the graph flattens, it corresponds to some decrease in behavioral responses, sometimes after the reward arrives. So why is that not going to be the case with a variable interval schedule? Good job. If there's anything that doesn't make sense, just send me an email, and thanks to Chris for narrating, and thank you for watching.